Hello, everyone. Okay, well, so welcome to the nervous system part one. Today we are going to be taking notes on part one and part two. Actually, it's all part one. It's quite long, so I have provided fill-in notes. If you did not pick up your notes from class, you can go ahead and take the notes directly on page 49. You are going to be converting these to Cornell notes, so make sure that when you glue it in, maybe you cut off part of one end so you can actually add questions because they're not formatted for Cornell notes, but you need to make these Cornell notes, and they are going to go starting on page 49. You're actually going to glue if you have the fill-ins, you can glue them on page 49. Make sure that you only glue from one side because it is a front and back copy. Okay, so this is a drawing of the brain. You have a worksheet that's entitled Chapter 35-3, the brain. Um, and you're going to use pages 901 and 902 to figure all this stuff out. So in the worksheet, you have to label the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the spinal cord, and the brainstem, and the thalamus and hypothalamus. So this is a picture from your book. I don't believe your book actually shows you guys that the brainstem is actually made out of the pons and the medulla oblongata, but here this drawing does. It's very similar to the one in your book. So try to use different colors. I know that there's very muted colors and like earthy colors used on this. I would like you guys to use more colors that pop on yours because I want you guys to clearly like use greens and reds and purples and blues and just like rainbow colors to do these different parts. And you're only you don't have to worry about like the pituitary gland at this point. Even though I would appreciate you guys labeling everything here, you're only responsible for coloring the parts that are the 5 parts that you're asked for. Please make sure you specify which color, using red for the cerebrum, for instance, and that's what you write on the lines. Then once you label them on your drawing, you have to make sure you describe this because when I grade this is the number one reason people lose like most of their points. It's because they are unable to describe or they did never described it. They labeled it, everything looks great, it looks beautifully colored, but no description is given. So what do they do? What do they control? Because every part of the brain controls something. You are going to write down, like for instance, the spinal, the cerebellum once again. What does it control? What its function? So they basically you can find that out on page 902, or you can simply do an internet search, and we'll give you lots of useful information. So, communication is the key to success. If you know about the nervous system at all, you know that your body works like a team. And communicate because your heart needs to know what your liver's doing and your liver needs to know what your brain's doing. Everything needs to be in contact with one another. So, like a team, your body systems work together in order to get you guys to work well. All of our body, if one part of our body doesn't like play along with everybody else, we're basically going to die. If your kidneys decide one day to just stop working, you're gonna die. So the fact of the matter is that everything needs to stay in high communication. So our bodies are basically the nervous system in our bodies. I'm sorry, is the controls and coordinates the functions through the body in response to internal and external stimulus. So your body, if it gets hot, it produces sweat. It will coordinate efforts to produce sweat, or it might tell you to tell, Miss Torres to turn up the air conditioning. It sends basically what you feel. It sends messages. It brings messages in from the outside to tell your body systems to do the X, Y, or Z and get your body to actually stay where it needs to be or in homeostasis. So the nervous system is basically a very great part of homeostasis to maintain your body at a stable internal environment. So the nervous system is made out of 3 structures, which are the brain, which you colored and labeled, I hope, spinal cord, which is encased in the bone that is your spine, and then the peripheral nerves, which is anything that is not the nerves that are not part of the spinal cord and brain. So any nerve that is not made up of the spinal cord and brain, not in the spinal cord or brain, is called a peripheral nerve, or the nerves outside of the spinal cord and brain. Okay, the function is to recognize and coordinate the body's responses to changes in internal as well as external stimulus. So the nervous system is to get you to coordinate and to make sure that you're all working every body system is working together in order to maintain your homeostasis. And communication is the key system to maintain, to get all your organs to work together to make sure that you stay healthy. So, can you think of examples being transmitted from your body to your brain or vice versa right now as you're sitting there taking and listening to this? Think about it. Right now, if you're sitting down, your body has to coordinate. If you think about ever watching a little baby, if you've been around a little baby or you are around a little baby, maybe a little brother, sister, or cousin, or a little tiny baby right after they're born, or even a month later, they have not they don't know how to communicate. Their nervous system is brand new. It's there. It's fully formed, but they don't know to command anything. They have no idea how to, if they're young enough, they can't even figure out their eyes. There's little babies that, like, if you move fast enough, their eyes will get crossed because they don't know how to control them. One will be facing one way and the other another way. They look really funny, and you have to actually manually get them to close their eyes just to straighten them out. There's little babies that do that. Or have you ever tried to get a little month-old baby or 2-month-old baby to sit up? They actually need help. You'll sit them down and you're like, okay, they're ready to go. Don't do this on the floor, by the way. You do it on a bed. You try to sit them down. You put pillows around them, and they're like leaning over every which way. They can't even turn around. I mean, they can actually suffocate if you put them face down on anything because they don't know how to control any of their bodies. Systems. Their nervous system is brand new and they don't know how to control it yet. So, like, their arms will flail around them and they have no idea what their hands are, and they'll scratch themselves, or it'll wind up in their mouth and then they start sucking on them. I mean, it's just crazy. Little babies cannot control their nervous system. So it gives you great appreciation for what you're doing right now. If you're sitting there straight up with your feet down, your nervous system knows how to control that. So you can control your body, your hands, your mouth, everything else. And you've learned that over the years. If you want to know about how long it took you, you may want to talk to your parents about how long it took you to figure out how to use your hands, for instance, or even walking. So the basic unit of the nervous system is called a neuron. So if it's a cell of we don't call it like a neuron. A neuron is basically a nerve cell. That's what it is. So we call these neurons. And they carry messages throughout the nervous system. The nervous system tissue is made up of neurons. That's what we say. And here we've got a really good picture of some of the neurons that we see in real life. This is what they look like. They don't look like the greatest, but that's what we need in order to get information. We need these like hairy things that go out and catch all the stuff that's going on and bring that information into your system, into your central nervous system to tell your brain what's going on. So these right here are actually a picture taken of actual neurons. Okay, so the picture on the last slide was like real actual neurons. This is a cartoon version of what you're looking at. And if on your notes, if you have them, you could turn your paper to the right, kind of over, and label this. I know it's not as dark as I wish it would have come out, but it came out really light. You may want to darken it a little bit to look like this. So the parts of a neuron include, from the head, you've got right there dendrites, the little hairy things at the top by the cell body. They spring out of the cell body and those capture all the information. Dendrites capture information. After that, you've got your cell body, and that's like the biggest part, and it has the nucleus inside. So the cell body is where all the stuff happens, where you make all your proteins that are needed by the cell, and all the stuff that needs to happen in the cell happen. Then you've got this tail. This tail is called an axon. The axon is a long tail, and the long tail has wrapping around it called myelin. The myelin is made out of these things called Schwann cells. That's individual. The myelin sheath is made out of little parts called Schwann cells after the doctor that found them. And there's little gaps between the Schwann cells of the myelin sheath called nodes. Those nodes help the message being sent down the tail go faster. So nodes. And at the end of the axon, you have these things called axon terminals. And those are like the out. Okay, so that's basically your neuron. Make sure you label all the parts. So the parts of the neuron, here you are. I'm going to explain to you what each part does once again. So just quicker, so you guys can write it down. So the cell body contains a nucleus, cytoplasm, the center of metabolic activity. So that's where the cell does everything that it needs to do in order to keep the other parts alive. Dendrites, those dendrites that are sticking up out of the cell body, they carry impulses from the environment or other neurons towards the cell body. So they bring stuff in. Dendrites bring stuff in. Axon. Axons are fibers that carry the impulse away from the cell body, so they carry it out. So that's a long fiber that carries the information out. Okay, so continuing on the parts. Next, I talked about the myelin sheath made out of Schwann cells. It's an insulating membrane that surrounds the axon. We'll talk later on about some horrible diseases where the body actually starts attacking. ALS is one of them, where it attacks the myelin sheath, and once it's kind of like an electrical cord where you rip off all the basically the rubber that insulates it, they stop working. Well, the same thing happens to our neurons. They stop working if you rip away all the myelin or the body starts eating it away. So we're going to talk more about the problems with that later on, but the myelin sheath is really super, insulation is really important. Nodes. Those nodes are the gaps in between the myelin sheath made from the Schwann cells not being stuck together. Basically, they help the impulse travel down the neuron faster, sends a message faster. So because of the openings, the message can travel faster or jump over from node to node. Axon terminals. They're the branches at the end of the axon through which the nerve impulse leaves the nerve. So it's the way out. The axon terminals, think terminal, the end. So terminal means end. So the end of the axons. So there's three kinds of neurons that we find in our bodies, and they're classified according to the direction in which an impulse is traveling. Okay, so sensory neurons carry information, carry the impulses from the sense organs to the spinal cord and brain. So basically, it takes the information from the outside and brings them all in. So those are all the nerves that are associated, all the neurons that are associated with bringing information in. Okay, your eyes would be filled with these. They're basically filled with sensory neurons. The tips of your fingers, sensory neurons. They bring information in. Motor neurons. Motor neurons carry impulses away from the brain and spinal cord to the muscles and glands. So basically, brain to muscle. So it takes the information back out. So like you see something coming at your head, and it goes to that information goes to your brain through sensory neurons. The brain sends out duck that would be going out through motor neurons. That information to duck would be a motor neuron thing. Then you've got your interneuron things. You connect to sensory and motor neurons and carry impulses between them. Neuron connectors. So neuron connectors basically would be like how the information gets from your toes to your spinal cord. So basically, you have these interneurons that function to connect a sensory and a motor neuron together. Your brain, so the sensory, all your sensory neurons are connected to your brain. Well, then the brain is basically made out of a whole bunch of interneurons because they're not sensing anything. They're just getting the information. They're not motor neurons because they're not actually getting the muscles to do anything. They're just sending the message to the muscles to do something. So the motor neurons carry their sensory neurons bring the information to the brain, which the brain, all the neurons in the brain are called interneurons. And then those interneurons basically tell the motor neurons, send the message out the motor neuron to tell something, part of your muscle or your body what to do. So a reflex arc, write this down. Okay, so if you did this really fast, this is an automatic response to stimulus. So that could be like ducking if you hear someone yelling or anything else like that. Okay, we're going to talk about how this happens. Okay, so a reflex arc. It's a pathway that an impulse travels for a reflex. So basically, it's you see the arrows here in the drawing. It's basically an arc pathway. It's what the way an impulse travels in order for you to like kick up your foot when the doctor hits you with that little hammer that they use to check your reflexes. So basically, the reflexes are something different, and it's how your body reflexively responds to internal stimulus. That's what a reflex arc is. It's how your body does reflexes. We're going to talk about how you kick up your knee right now, and I'll go into the details in the next slide. So a reflex arc. So there's these sensory receptors in your knee, and there's a little patch of neurons right there. They're sensory neurons. They're receptors. So you basically get the hammer, that would be the stimulus, and it would hit the little patch of neurons right there, the receptors there, and those receptors would then send that information through the sensory neuron to all the way to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, there's interneurons. Right there, there's an interneuron that basically says, should I send this message up to the brain or do I know what to do? The sensory neuron figures, I know what to do with this, and doesn't send the message to your brain up the spinal cord to the brain. So the spinal cord just figures, I know what to do here, and then it sends the motor neuron to the muscle, which is the effector, the muscle, and the motor neuron tells that muscle, you know what, you need to squeeze, you need to contract. And that's how your leg winds up going up. And that's why it's not that your leg is going up and kicking that surprises you. It's the fact that it's doing it without your brain knowing it. That is a reflex. So here's a better picture that includes kind of your knee, the whole leg. So you've got the hammer, the stimulus hitting the little receptors right there of the neurons, of the sensory neurons. So that little patch of receptors gets hit, the neurons get stimulated. That stimulus goes all the way up that nerve to the nervous cell body, the sensory neurons. And then the blue you see there, it's traveling in the blue. It's going into the gray matter that is found in the spinal cord. And then you've got your interneurons in the green there that says, hey, I know what to do, and sends the motor neurons in red. You have your motor neurons in red here. That sends a message back to the muscles that are found, the effectors, that are found in your calf, hamstring muscle and your quadricep. And the quadricep muscle contracts while the hamstring muscle relaxes. Those are the messages that are being sent. So that stimulus winds up telling the spinal cord tells those two motor neurons to send the messages for your quadricep to contract and your hamstring to relax. And that's how that reflex happens. And nowhere here do you see the brain involved, so that's why it's kind of funny to watch your body move without you. So, been talking a lot about a nerve impulse. So, what exactly, or what the heck is a nerve impulse? What do we keep talking? Why do I keep on talking about that? Okay, so time to clarify. So, an impulse is a message or stimulus sent by a neuron. So, it's basically an impulse is any kind of message or stimulus that we basically call a message stimulus here. A stimulus can be anything. It could be a hammer that lands on your finger or things like that, or it could be someone like doing something funny and in your eyes see it and you think it's funny, so that would be the impulse. So it sends a message. So or it's sent by a neuron. So then if the neuron is sending the message, it's basically an impulse. Okay, a stimulus is a signal to which an organism responds to a stimulus. Response. So a stimulus could be anything that your brain can sense. So touching a hot stove, turning the lights out, those are considered stimulus. That's what happens. In response, brain to muscles, the brain, for example, to a hot stove, the brain tells the muscles to contract to pull away your hand from the hot stove, to pull your hand away as fast as you can. Or turning the lights out, your brain tells the pupils in your eyes to dilate, to get really big so you can see better in the dark. And so those are responses. So you have stimulus and you have response. A nerve impulse is a stimulus excites the nerve endings, the dendrites, which sends an impulse like an electrical current through the neuron. The impulse travels through a neuron from the dendrite to the cell body to the axon and out the axon terminal. And then there's neurotransmitters that relay the message to the next neuron. So that's the pathway in which the message all travels, or the impulse travels. Okay, in order to check your own knowledge here, please make sure you can actually answer all of these 4 questions. If you cannot, please review the notes again so far. Okay, so the nervous system part two, we're going to go ahead and continue on with this now. So the resting neuron, there is no impulse traveling through a neuron. So when you're not using it, there's no impulse traveling, and that means it's resting. We call this, it's in resting potential, which means an electrical charge across the membrane of the resting neuron is negative on the inside, and the neuron is, on the outside of the neuron, it's positive. And that we know that that's when it's at rest. Okay, so here's a neuron. You have this drawing. Please make sure you label it accordingly. So, a moving impulse. When a neuron receives an impulse from the environment or from another neuron, the impulse must be strong enough to stimulate the response, like a domino effect. An impulse is all or nothing. So, like, imagine yourself, you're yelling to your friend across the quad. And you're yelling, and then there's a point at which can actually hear you. Before that, they couldn't hear you. You could have been yelling, calling them, they couldn't hear you. But then you get loud enough, and they can hear you. Well, think about that. That sometimes you get stimulus and it doesn't cause you don't get an impulse. You get stimulus, 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 and then the stimulus becomes higher or more, and then finally you get the impulse. So that's the way it works. You won't get an impulse until it gets to a certain point. An action potential is basically what we call a moving impulse. It's basically a nerve impulse. The action potential moves down the neuron from the dendrite to the axon, then to the synapse. What this basically means, and write this down, and when you write it down, highlight it. This is what an action potential is: a rapid reversal of charges from negative to positive along the neuron. Okay, for this slide, make sure that you write down the information at the bottom and that you completely understand how it goes from negative to positive on the inside. So A, it's negative on the inside. B, part of it becomes positive. The next one, the next section becomes positive. And the final one, or D, the last section becomes, it goes back to being what it is. So that's how we get the action potential. It's like kind of like a little domino effect. Once you get it started, it just goes down the line. This one, you should see a little zap going right through from the beginning to the end, and that's the way the action potential travels. In this slide, you can see the action potential moving down the neuron from the dendrites to action, then back to the synapse. So you'll be able to see how it goes from negative to positive as it moves along. It's kind of like a little domino effect, and it works in really fast motion. This one's in low slow motion. So you'll see how it goes negative. The outside goes from positive to negative. The inside goes negative to positive. So you see a change on the outside and the inside of the neuron. So the synapse, it's a gap between the axon terminals of a neuron and another cell through which the impulse is transferred. For example, the axon terminal of one neuron ends and the dendrite of another begins. You'll see a little picture at the end where actually you see that little gap because the axon terminals never really touch anything. It never touches where it's attached to. There's always a little gap. Neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals used by a neuron to transmit an impulse across the synapse to another cell. Neurotransmitters are secreted from the ends of the axon terminals and stimulate the adjacent cells. So this is how it communicates. When the impulse gets to the end of the axon terminals, basically axon terminals start spewing out these things called neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters, basically, if enough of them get released, it starts an action potential in the next cell. So that's how they communicate. Okay, so this is the last figure. You have to label this at the next page. You have this in your book. It's figure 35H. Please make sure you label all the parts. And here you can see the neurotransmitters. Also, little drawing in the bottom. There's a tiny little gap. That's what we're seeing right here. That little gap. It's kind of like a ball and socket type of thing where you see that, but they never really touch. There's a little gap there called the synapse. Okay, so this is a conclusion of these notes. You guys, just finish them up and make sure that you get them turned in as soon as possible. Thank you. Bye.